As part of the upgrade to Atomic Automation version 24, there is a new Universal Language Support requirements, meaning the database has to support Unicode. Unicode is a text encoding standard supporting a wide range of writing systems. As a direct consequence, the Atomic database needs to support UTF-8 encoding. This requirement was never explicit in prior versions, and so some databases may be using a different standards. Prior to upgrading Atomic instances to 24, customers will need to migrate any database not using UTF-8 to one that does, before the actual data structures and assets. This means this process is not part of ZDU. Broadcom provides a migration tool with the version 24 install package. We've designed 2 learning modules to describe the UTF migration, configuration, and execution. In the case of production instances, rigorous care should be taken in implementing the upgrade methods we've outlined in the past, especially to version 21. You can use these modules to test the UTF-8 migration tool extensively before proceeding, but ultimately you should seek assistance from our support and service teams to perform production migrations and upgrades. In this first module, we provide the technical details of the tool. In the second one, we'll show how to roll it out in a demo. These are the steps. First, you should update 3 variables in UC system settings on client 0. Then we create a new database in either Oracle, DB2, or SQL Server. If your database currently resides in Postgres, then you're already UTF-8 compliant and you can bypass this training altogether. The migration tool requires the DB variables agent, which is a service agent. It needs to be installed on the Automation Engine host and requires some configuration as well. The tool also requires the SQL agent on the DB host to submit processes to the DB instance. It's the same installation package as the DB service agent, but the configuration and start procedure are slightly different. We download and deploy the migration pack, which contains a number of objects, varas, prom sets, cons, and the migration workflow. We configure 2 predefined con objects, one for the source Atomic database and one for the destination. Finally, we execute the workflow. First, there are 3 UC system settings variables that we have to change. The first is SQL var internal, so the workflow is able to set SQL internal variables, including the secure. The next is var security level, which needs to be set to 3, meaning the least restrictive. The migration workflow will use variables and var objects, including placeholders and prom set variables. The next is SQL var max rows, which needs to be set to any value above 1,000. This sets the maximum number of records retrievable by variables of type SQL and SQLi. It doesn't really matter what value you set it to, but it needs to be above 1,000. Next, follow the usual methods to create a new database in SQL Server, Oracle, or DB2 to host version 24. Each DB package has specific requirements, which are clearly listed in the documentation. We've provided the basic character set requirements, meaning the UTF-8 collation for SQL Server, and string parameters for Oracle and DB2. Remember, if you're using Postgres, you're already UTF-8 compliant. Also, keep in mind that you don't need an additional user. You'll be using the existing user or database login assigned to your current Atomic database in SQL Server. That user will be assigned to the new database as well. Next, we have to install the DB variables agent, also commonly referred to as DB service agents. This agent is installed on the AE host and processes SQL type variable objects. You install the agent in a dedicated directory and configure it using the ini file. You set the name, system, JCP connection, and port, the trusted cert folder directory, which contains the TLS certificate. You'll need to copy the certificate from another agent host or the AWI system and store it locally, and then reference the location and password. You'll have to set the type, either SQL Server, Oracle, or DB2. Make sure you create a JDBC directory in the agent's bin directory and a supported version of the SQL Server JDBC driver. In all cases, the agent is a Java process, and Java should already be there for the Automation Engine. To start the agent, cd to the bin directory and run the start procedure through the Java command with the -service option. The agents will be listed as the DB service in AWI. Next, we have to install the SQL agents on the DB host so that Atomic can submit processes locally to the database. The package is the same as the DB service agents. The configuration ini file is exactly the same and the fields are identical. Note that SQL Server has the authentication requirements. You need to specify either Windows authentication, where the user who starts the agents automatically authenticates the SQL Server instance, or a specific user defined in SQL Server, which requires a login object. Our recommendation is to bypass the entire requirements by updating the UC hostcard default variable in the host variables folder on client 0 and set the anonymous job value to yes. All other requirements are the same as the DB service agents, except you start without the -service option. Next, you download and deploy the migration pack. The pack is obtainable through the usual Atomic download sources. Use the administration perspective, go to the packs page, and install from file. Once this is done, you can head to Process Assembly. The package is found in the Packages folder. The objects are stored in the Move non-UTF-8 DB to UTF-8 folder under Source. There, you will see the workflow, and the Setup Objects folder contains 2 con objects that require information. The workflow is a true-false type with 2 branches for ILM versus no ILM. Each job contains scripts and SQL jobs to execute various tasks like creating tables and copying the data. Next, we configure the 2 con objects. Con objects are the standard method to connect to an Atomic database via the DB service agents. The forms and fields are exactly the same. One is the source DB and the other one is the destination. You select the type, the host name and ports, and the database name. You provide the ID and password of the user assigned to both databases. Remember, you should not create a user for the new database. Use the existing one instead. Finally, you test the connection. The 2 types of issues you may run into are either tied to the agents or to authentication, meaning the ID does not match or the password is wrong. If everything is set up correctly, you'll get a successful connection test. Don't forget to create a new ODBC source if you're using SQL Server. Finally, we execute the workflow. As opposed to the con objects which use the DB service agents, this is the actual workload process which runs through the SQL agents installed locally on the DB host. We execute the workflow. We're prompted for a number of data points. You have to select the SQL agent you installed on the DB host and the run mode. 0 is the initial migration, all the historical data, messages, and object audits, up to the point defined by change logging days. 1 is for a data refresh, meaning the delta since initial, and 2 only generates the SQL scripts for your DBA team to execute once the database has been taken offline. The SQL statements are emailed at the address you provide. They're also copied to a var object. We'll get back to this. If you're deploying in Oracle, you can create the DB link between the source and destination databases, either automatically with the workflow or manually with a query. The DBA team would do this. The link is the communication path between the source and destination databases. We've provided the manual DB link syntax in the documentation. The link must be created automatically for DB2, and SQL Server has different requirements explained here. If you use separate instances in SQL Server, then you'll have additional requirements for the UC4 source link server with sp_add link server on which distributed queries can execute. Again, on SQL Server, you're able to use separate databases for AE in the message queue tables. This is common knowledge. If that is the case, then you'll need to set the field to 1. As we've mentioned, SQL statements are emailed to the address specified in the prompt. However, let's say SMTP is not enabled or the email integration is not set up. Those SQL statements will also be copied to a static variable called UTF-8 email content final steps. Let's consider the workflow and what it does. We're not going to spend too much time on this as the workflow is fairly elaborate and does quite a bit. It has 5 main tasks. The first one is a script that checks the character set of the database. The second task is a workflow that runs the complete first-time migration, meaning mode 0. This workflow is a combination of SQL jobs and 1 script that create the Oracle DB link if you requested it, checks the table spaces, preps the source database, creates the tables, copies the data, and creates the index in the destination database. All the SQL jobs use the con objects. If you selected mode 1, meaning you've already migrated the database and are merely refreshing the data, then mode 0 and 2 jobs are skipped. If you select mode 2, then jobs for mode 0 and 1 are skipped.